I've played the Outlast Trials for over 1,000 hours. I've completed every trial on the highest difficulty and unlocked every single achievement the game has to offer. So this isn't a first impressions review, it's the complete picture. And what surprised me the most about the Outlast Trials wasn't how scary the game was, it's how well the game really holds up after the fear is gone. Most horror games lose their edge once you understand them, but the Outlast Trials doesn't. So today I'm going to talk about what it's actually like to fully complete the Outlast Trials, what the game does exceptionally well, and where it starts to show its cracks. I'm also going to go into the things that you only notice once you've seen everything. Alright, hey guys, what is up? It is Bibzuda, and today's video is going to be a little bit different from my usual Outlast Trials content. This is essentially the pilot for a new series I've been wanting to do for a long time that is going to be centered around completionism. For years now, I have been working through my games in my Steam library with the goal of 100% of completion, getting 100% achievements on them. And I know achievements aren't something that everyone cares about, but for me, going for all the achievements in a game really usually forces you to engage with all of the content the game has to offer. And it can generally push you towards a certain level of mastery of the game, and in doing so can also expose cracks in the game's design that will often reveal things you might never notice even on a normal playthrough. So in this series, I want to combine three things. First of all, I will have a full review or critique of the game itself. Secondly, I will have a breakdown of the achievement list. What does it ask of you? What do you need to do to complete it? How reasonable is it? And if it's actually something that rewards mastery of the game or just a time investment or grind. And finally, for games I haven't already completed, I'll be documenting my path to 100%, including the hardest achievements that could have videos of their own, and anything worth knowing if you're going to try and attempt 100% completion of it yourself. And this is partially in an effort to expand my content, but honestly, I've always really wanted to make videos like this, even before I started making the Outlast Trials videos that are already on this channel. So instead of continuing to overthink and delay and not make the videos, I'm just going for it with this one. And I'm starting with the Outlast Trials since it will be a decent transition period, I think. It's already the focus of my channel, and I think it makes for a perfect first test of the format I'm going for here. This video will have some spoilers for some specific trials and many of the game's internal systems, but you won't really lose too much by watching this if you plan to play it or you're considering it yourself. So with all that out of the way, let's get into it. Though I'm sure most regular viewers of my channel are already familiar with the Outlast Trials, part of the goal of this pilot episode is to establish a more consistent format for the series going forward. So before we get into the critique itself, I want to briefly talk about what the game is and how it works. Because the Outlast Trials is a live service game, it has evolved quite significantly since its launch, even after version 1.0 came out. So I want to emphasize that I'll be focusing on the game in its current state as of the making of this video, which is just after the start of Season 5, Project Messiah. The Outlast Trials is the third entry in Red Barrel's Outlast series and is their first attempt at creating a multiplayer title. The original Outlast was a huge success and set a new standard for modern horror games. Both the original game and Outlast 2 were strictly single player and mostly linear experiences. Moving to the co-op, replayable structure for the Outlast Trials was a significant departure from that formula and a pretty risky one. Thankfully, they absolutely nailed it. I had played and enjoyed both of the previous games before the Outlast Trials, and I first jumped into the game in the closed beta. I then immediately purchased it on its early access release, and I've been playing it ever since. It is easily my favorite ongoing game and ranks high on my list of all-time favorites. That said, it is not a perfect game. And especially on games I enjoy this much, I personally tend to focus on where things can be improved. I'm stating this up front in case the review or critique portions of this video come off as overly negative, which is not really my intention. From a narrative standpoint, the game is once again centered around the Murkoff Corporation, a massive international conglomerate that conducts unethical and horrific experiments for profit. This game takes place prior to the events of both Outlast and Outlast 2 within a facility known as Signala, where Murkoff is attempting to develop sleeper agents for use in their global operations. I won't be diving deeply into the lore in this video, but it is very well thought out and super interesting, so I would highly recommend checking out Gaming Harry's videos if you want a full breakdown of Outlast Trials lore. As a player, you take control of one of these test subjects known as a reagent. Your experiences within the Signala facility form the basis for the game, and this framing is what allows the multiplayer to feel really grounded in the world. You work alongside other reagents undergoing the same experience in the facility. One area that developer Red Barrels really excels, which shines especially clearly in the Outlast Trials, is keeping all the game systems and mechanics grounded in the game world. Very little exists simply because it's a game. The systems are contextualized in the universe, and that helps the experience feel cohesive and very immersive. After a couple short cinematics to set up the story and background, the game starts you out in a tutorial mission. This is meant to teach you the basics of movement, how various items work, and some idea of how the objectives will work in the real trials. It's mostly pretty functional, but in the modern version of the game with numerous complex objectives, it's starting to show its limitations. The game might be better served including additional, more focused, environment-specific tutorials instead of embedding them within the trials themselves, but we'll talk about that more a little bit later. Following this tutorial, the gameplay revolves around the titular trials, which are repeatable missions that see players exploring the various environments in the game and completing a set of objectives on each to succeed and escape. These objectives resemble things you may have seen as singular sections in the previous single-player games, but the additional mechanics that the Outlast Trials introduces allows them to include a bit more complexity. All the while, you are being hunted and harassed by the many enemies the game has to offer, with varying levels of difficulty and danger from each. One of the main differences from the earlier Outlast games is that players are no longer defenseless. The original games famously emphasized the run, hide, or die mantra, but the Outlast Trials instead allows players to scavenge items like bricks or bottles to temporarily fend off their enemies, and that adds an additional layer of agency and decision-making to enemy encounters. There are two mission types in the game, the full-length main trials and shorter missions that are known as MK challenges. At the start of early access, the game launched with only 3 maps and a pretty limited selection of trials on those maps, but it has been expanded significantly over time. As of this recording, the game is all the way up to 10 maps and gets frequent updates adding new trials, modes, and systems, and all of these updates are free. While the game does feature DLC and more recently an in-game store, these are limited entirely to cosmetic items. There is no content locked behind these DLCs, and that becomes relevant later when we talk about progression and long-term motivation. The broader gameplay loop involves completing trials which will reward you with experience, the primary currency which is called stamps, and rebirth tokens which will contribute to achieving this game's version of an ending. To keep the repeated trials engaging, they are modified with a system known as variators, which are rule changes that can do things like add additional enemies, add more hazards, or even other larger twists. Some of these variators are transformative enough to dramatically change how you approach certain trials. Beyond these standard trials, the game features several alternate modes, including a semi-roguelike mode, which is called Escalation, a custom trial maker, which allows players to apply variators freely to any trial they choose, and the most recently released mode called Invasion, which adds PvP elements to the game. Regular events and weekly rotations keep things fresh by introducing some new variators here and there or focusing trials on a specific theme. In between trials, players return to the Sleep Room, which is the game's central hub. This is where upgrades are purchased, cosmetics are managed, and trial groups can be formed. It also features several minigames, including arm wrestling and chess, which you can play in between trials to pass the time when you're waiting for your friends to get on. Even if you're playing solo though, the Sleep Room remains populated with other players, which helps the game feel more alive. From here, players can also assess their daily and weekly tasks, look at their PvP ranking, and their trial grades. That ensures there's almost always some sort of goal to work towards. Given the sheer number of trials in the Outlast Trials at this point, it wouldn't really make sense to go through each trial in detail, especially given the scope of this particular video. Instead, I'm going to focus on a single trial as a representative example of how the game works. For that, we'll be looking at Kill the Snitch, which is the first main trial that players will encounter. It's a perfect baseline for this because it teaches the core gameplay loop of managing your noise and threat level, objectives, and being constantly hunted while you learn the game. The main trials are longer, multi-stage missions, while MK challenges are shorter and more focused, and these can often resemble a single segment from one of the main trials. The game lists an estimated completion time of 45 minutes for every main trial, including Kill the Snitch, but there's no actual time limit, and the estimate itself is just a little bit interesting. For new players, that number is pretty optimistic most of the time, especially on some of the newer trials in the game. While on the other hand, experienced players can often complete these same trials in under 15 minutes. That gap alone will tell you a lot about how much knowledge and confidence matter in your completion time. Before we start the trial, now's a good time to discuss the difficulty system in the game. Difficulty in the Outlast Trials is handled almost entirely through the variator system. These are modifiers which change enemy presence, their damage, hazards, and a lot of other rules. In the standard Genesis game mode, trials can be played on 4 different difficulty levels: Introductory, Standard, Intensive, and Psychosurgery. New players are initially limited to only playing on Introductory, which significantly reduces the pressure from enemies, and it acts as a bit of a safety net to more easily learn the game's systems. Kill the Snitch is also unique in that on Introductory difficulty, it actually changes the layout and flow of the trial itself to make onboarding a bit easier for new players. Objectives are a little bit simplified, routes are more direct, and the exploration is pretty restricted. This is the only trial with this feature, and I won't be pointing out specific differences in this section. Higher difficulties often assume access to stronger unlocks and a deeper understanding of mechanics, but there's nothing strictly required, and skilled players can succeed easily, even with self-imposed limitations on their loadouts. When loading in to Kill the Snitch, players are immediately tasked with infiltrating the police station. Early on, the trial mostly funnels players down a pretty straightforward and controlled path, which enters the station and eventually leads to the security room, which acts as a temporary safe zone. These rally points are common in main trials and function as pacing checkpoints, and they'll often introduce major threats or show upcoming objectives through some short in-game cutscenes. In this case, the trial introduces Leland Coil, the prime asset associated with this map. Each map features one prime asset as its primary antagonist, and each comes with some unique mechanics. Coil's defining trait is that taking damage from his electrified baton will disable your rig for a short amount of time. This small twist can meaningfully change how you approach encounters with him, but that said, it's also the least impactful twist when compared to the other prime assets, which fits his positioning as the first one you're going to meet. From here, the trial begins introducing and layering objectives that emphasize one of the central design pillars of the game, which is noise management. The first real objective involves restoring power to the station by carrying a heavy fuel container to a generator in the basement, and this deliberately forces players into potentially risky situations where your movement is slower and sound can sometimes be unavoidable. Players are then tasked with pushing the Snitch, who is restrained to an electric chair along a track that travels through the map, and this process is slow, very loud, and constantly attracts attention from the enemies. As players progress and the trial opens up, they must locate keys tied to specific symbols in order to unlock gates and continue pushing the Snitch forward. At this point, the objectives can be completed in different orders, but progress will be blocked by the gates to encourage exploring the station and often leads to repeated enemy encounters. Upon repeated completion of the trial, players can learn the key spawn patterns, like the key corpse locations and safe routes between areas. This kind of knowledge can be learned in almost every single trial, and it drastically reduces completion time and stress as you learn the game. All trials also feature an optional secondary objective, which is collecting posters by default. Completing this objective will improve the final grade and reward additional currencies when you complete the trial. And in main trials, players can also discover the secret room, which contains powerful items and acts as a bit of a reward for exploring the environment. Eventually, the trial will culminate in a finale sequence, and in this case, players participate in a prolonged execution that requires players to repeatedly expose themselves to danger by generating massive amounts of noise with numerous nearby enemies. It's a tense, drawn-out process, especially on your first playthrough, but will come faster and more controlled as you get more experienced. After the execution is finally completed, you must still escape back to the shuttle, often under heavy pressure from enemies still remaining in the map. Once the trial is complete, players will receive a summary screen that details their performance. The rewards include experience points, stamps, and rebirth tokens with bonuses for higher difficulties, better grades, and completing the secondary objective. The grades are determined by a mix of positive and negative actions throughout the trial, which includes things like damage taken or avoided, using items or tools, and completing different objectives. Completing the trial with 0 mistakes and completing the secondary objective will guarantee you the best possible grade. This grading system plays an important role in shaping player behavior and long-term motivations, and I'll be digging into that further in the upcoming sections. Alright, now it's time to move into the review and critique portion of this video, and I want to emphasize that as a whole, the Outlast Trials is an excellent game and is easily worth playing in its current state. A big part of what makes it special, as I've mentioned, is that it remains engaging even after that initial fear wears off, and that is something that most horror games really struggle to achieve. Because of that, the points I'm going to raise here aren't about surface level problems you might notice in the first hour or two. They're the things that only really start to stand out after dozens of trials once you've learned the maps, understand the systems, and you're pushing towards mastery of the game. Looking at the game through that lens reveals where many systems shine, and where a few shortcomings undermine what it otherwise does so well. This is also where a completionist perspective really starts to matter, because chasing mastery exposes incentives and friction points that some casual play never will. The core gameplay of the Outlast Trials works as well as it does because it builds directly on what made the original Outlast games so effective while addressing their biggest long-term limitation. Many other horror games almost solely rely on avoidance. They see players consistently hiding and hoping to never meet their foes. Outlast, on the other hand, has always been different in that it often forces confrontation. You will be seen, you will be chased, and then you must escape to survive. The Outlast Trials takes that foundation and adds something essential: player agency. By giving players tools, options, and room for skill expression, the game introduces a much higher skill ceiling, and with it, the possibility of mastering the game. That agency is what allows a terrifying first-time experience to evolve into a deeply replayable game. Instead of degrading into a dull walking simulator like many other horror games, it reveals a surprisingly robust gameplay loop centered on learning and execution. The difference between a new player and an experienced one is not subtle. Completion times don't improve by a few minutes, they will drop dramatically. Routes will become optimized, every encounter becomes controlled, and what once felt overwhelming becomes manageable, maybe even elegant. It's enthralling. I've played some trials hundreds of times and still genuinely enjoy coming back to them. The return on investment for experience in the Outlast Trials is unusually high if you're willing to commit to learning the game. Early on, the game can feel brutally difficult and punishing, especially when fear dictates your every decision. One of the biggest breakthroughs new players can make is to develop the confidence to engage with enemies rather than simply avoiding them. As confidence grows, the game rewards that closer scrutiny. Small optimizations are everywhere, niche tricks that only benefit one specific trial, and more technical movement that'll improve your performance overall. This creates a powerful feedback loop. You want to keep grinding, shave a few more seconds off your run, push into a higher difficulty, or chase that perfect A+ grade. That sense of progression can easily sustain dozens, even hundreds of hours of playtime. However, as you continue repeating trials and pushing the systems to their limits, certain things start to show strain, and that's where the critique really begins. One of the most visible points of friction in the Outlast Trials comes from the balancing between onboarding new players and maintaining long-term replayability. The game has a steep learning curve by design, and that curve has only grown steeper over time as new objectives, variators, and enemies have been added. Despite this, the core tutorial experience has remained largely unchanged since the game's early versions. To be clear, required learning through experience is not inherently a problem. In fact, it is one of the game's greatest strengths that I just got finished praising. Much of the Outlast Trials becomes more rewarding the more you experiment, fail, adapt, and learn. However, this philosophy breaks down when key systems or components are either underexplained or not explained at all. Certain enemies like the Jaeger, key incentive mechanics like rebirth and relapse, and even fundamental difficulty changes like increased enemy speed on psychosurgery are left largely to player discovery or external resources. Some level of mystery can be engaging, like with the prime assets and their abilities, but some of these gaps can leave new players confused or overwhelmed in ways that feel unintentional rather than challenging. At the same time, the game even more often goes too far in the opposite direction. Many trials rely heavily on mandatory in-trial tutorials that walk players through basic objectives even after dozens or hundreds of completions. These segments are often completely safe, regardless of difficulty, and are impossible to skip. Kill the Snitch, which we reviewed earlier, offers a relatively mild example of this problem. The trial introduces its key mechanic by forcing the player to harvest a key nearby to the first gate before being allowed to progress with the trial. And this works well as an initial teaching moment, but repeating it on every trial eventually becomes a bit of a chore. In this case, however, the presence of at least one enemy on higher difficulties helps justify the sequence, but the underlying issue still remains. A more extreme example of this can be found in Vindicate the Guilty, a main trial on the map Courthouse. This trial contains multiple lengthy tutorial segments which include the blacklight number puzzle, carrying acid buckets, and the witness sequence. All of these must be completed every single time you do the trial and pose essentially zero danger at all. Over repeated runs, these sections can account for a significant portion of the trial's total duration, and at that point, they're no longer educational and start actively undermining the tension and momentum that make the game so engaging. What makes this especially frustrating is that a somewhat better approach is already demonstrated in the current version of the game. Recently, Kill the Snitch got the altered introductory version I mentioned before, which functions as a true onboarding experience for the trial. It completely simplifies the trial structure only on that difficulty, which won't impact later runs on standard or above. Unfortunately though, as it stands right now, the game never revisits this idea. Instead, tutorials are continually baked directly into trials even as new trials come out, in a way that prioritizes first-time clarity at the expense of their long-term replayability. At this stage, it's honestly probably too late to fully disentangle tutorials from every trial. However, a much more scalable solution would be to separate objective tutorials from live gameplay entirely. For example, through map-specific training trials that players must complete once before engaging with the main and MK challenges of that map. These will then serve as an optional refresher if players need to go back to them, but this would also preserve the accessibility for new players that the current tutorials do very well, while allowing experienced players to engage with the trials at full pace without repeated interruptions from learning experiences. Next, I want to take a deeper look at difficulty, variators, and how they enable skill expression. The variator system that Red Barrels has created for Outlast Trials is, in my opinion, one of the game's strongest design achievements. Difficulty doesn't rely on simple enemy stat increases, it is instead built around a modular set of rules that alter the enemies, hazards, player limitations, and even core mechanics like movement or item usage. This system makes difficulty feel primarily driven by the player's skill. Some variators make the game harder by increasing enemy pressure or restricting player options, while others can actually reduce the difficulty by limiting the enemy's behavior or adding consistency to trial mechanics. This flexibility is most visible in the custom trial creator, where players can combine up to 8 variators to create highly specific challenges tailored to their skill level or personal goals. In standard play, difficulty settings are essentially predefined variator sets. Moving from introductory to psychosurgery doesn't change the trial itself so much as it changes which modifiers are applied to it. This works well as a baseline system, but it also reveals a bit of a missed opportunity. Within the Genesis program, these difficulty presets are completely static. On psychosurgery, every single trial uses the same variator configuration, meaning players are never exposed to some of the more interesting or experimental modifiers unless they actively seek them out through events, escalation, or custom trials. This matters because variators and their effects are where the game's depth truly lives. At higher levels of play, mastery is demonstrated not only through survival, but through optimization. Tiny movement efficiencies, enemy manipulation, route planning, and niche trial-specific knowledge all begin to matter at this stage. Trials that would completely overwhelm a new player can become controlled, even routine, in the hands of an expert. The ceiling here is effectively endless, and the game continually feeds it with new trials and modifiers with each passing update. At the same time, the existing difficulty presets can create sharp jumps for players that are trying to improve. With only the 4 base options, moving up a difficulty level can sometimes feel like hitting a wall for someone who's inexperienced. Adding more preset difficulties probably isn't realistic, but the systems already available in the game provide a better alternative. Developer-curated custom trials with gradually increasing complexity could act as a bridge between difficulties. This would not only smooth out progression, but also introduce players to the custom trial system organically, encouraging their own experimentation rather than saving it for endgame challenges. These custom trials could come preloaded on a new player's custom trial list, also introducing the other features in the trial list like sharing and importing of others' trials. Despite these limitations, the difficulty and variator system remains one of the most compelling aspects of the Outlast Trials. It supports a wide range of skill levels, rewards player mastery without limiting it, and provides a foundation that continues to grow with each update. It's a system that largely succeeds, and one that could be even stronger with broader exposure to its own best ideas. This section will focus on progression, the grading system, and the incentives to play the game. Being a game focusing on this repeatable mission concept, the Outlast Trials features a progression system where players level up by completing trials, unlocking upgrades as levels increase. These include permanent improvements, and a loadout system which includes 3 perk slots and a choice of rig, which are special items with unique effects to help you survive the trials. This system has seen several additions since launch, mainly in the form of new perks, a few new permanent unlocks, and some new rigs. This system works pretty well for the most part, with the player growing stronger as their level increases. The most problematic portion of the loadout progression comes in the form of the perks, which are known as amps in the game. They come in 3 categories, and for the loadout, players can choose 1 amp from each category when they're heading into a trial. Amps are unique in that they are the only unlock in the entire game with a strict level requirement. Starting at level 10, players will unlock batches of 3 amps every 5 levels. The problem arises when considering which amps a player wants to purchase. Leveling up only provides a limited amount of currency with which to purchase upgrades, and that is used for all purchasable unlocks. Players need to decide carefully what they want to buy, with each option demonstrating an opportunity cost by giving up purchasing something else. Being a perk selection system, only 1 amp of each category can be used, but as with most systems like this, some are clearly quite stronger than others. The problem is, before the amps are unlocked, players are unable to see what they are and what they do. As such, early on, without all the amps unlocked, they may mistakenly purchase an amp that they later come to regret buying as they unlock a much better one. Of course, this can just be looked up on Google, or a video can be watched that describes all the amps, but I don't really believe that to be a valid excuse for problems like this, as some players don't want to get spoiled like that. We need to look no further than the other interchangeable unlocks, the rigs, to see a better version of this system. Players can view all of the rigs and even review informational videos on how they work at any time. Despite upgrades of rigs requiring a set order of purchases, all of them are visible prior to any purchase. Amps should also work this way to allow more informed choices to be made with valuable level up currency. Because the amps can meaningfully shape how the players will approach the trials, this poor information transparency early on can undermine experimentation and long-term engagement with the system. Additionally, the balancing of the various amps and rigs could be a bit better in the game. Each category of amp usually has at least 1 or 2 that are the clear best, while some are borderline useless. But players can mix and match depending on their playstyle and goals, which helps a little bit. Rigs could also use additional tweaks, but they are more frequently updated than amps. Opinions occasionally vary on this, and playstyle matters here too, but for the most part, rig strength has remained the same for the majority of the game's lifespan. There's 1 rig that's clearly the strongest, some that are certainly the worst, and then a few that complement certain playstyles or roles in a group setting. If rigs were more evenly balanced, they could become a greater consideration depending on the specific trial players were entering. This already exists to some extent, but could still be improved in certain ways. Some of the most enjoyable parts of past updates were the additions of new amps and rigs. They offered new customization options for the loadout and generally increased the knowledge and skill ceiling of the game. With these new tools, players' knowledge of how they could be utilized is put to the test. Unfortunately, it has been quite a while since the last amp or rig was added. This is something I hope they revisit in the future alongside balancing the existing items, as it is always an exciting occurrence when it does happen in an update. There's also a prestige system in the game called Relapse, which allows players to reset their level upon reaching the max, losing all of their unlocks but receiving a permanent unlock token as a result. This allows for endless earning of XP and leveling up to keep that as a consistent reward from the trials, as eventually, with enough gameplay, you'll run out of things to buy with the stamps as the currency reward. In my opinion, this system is essentially flawless for what it is, but could potentially use a few additional cosmetic rewards to motivate additional resets. Alongside XP, stamps are the universal reward for most activities, which can then be used to purchase cosmetics from the various catalogs. There are multiple free catalogs available, with a new one released every season, and you can purchase catalogs from past events using the store currency, which can be purchased for real money. However, if you complete the event catalogs during the event itself, they are completely free as well. During an event, a unique token currency is used, which is separate from the universal stamps but acquired in similar ways. The only downside of this system is that excess tokens at the end of an event are simply lost. Ideally, they would be converted to stamps or maybe XP to give players an incentive to keep playing event content even after they complete the catalog. These catalogs provide numerous cosmetics which can be used to customize the appearance of your reagent, as well as customize your individual cell in the sleep room. Stamps are also earnable via daily and weekly tasks to help players earn them more quickly and give players goals each time they log in. The task system also includes one-off tasks for acquiring all the upgrades in the game and completing trials for the first time. This system works quite well and remains an incentive for hundreds of hours for new players. It also gives reasons for players to come back with each new season, as there they're offering more cosmetic items to unlock. The only issue with this system is really revealed after hundreds if not thousands of trials, when a player has purchased everything and their stamps begin to pile up. Nowadays for me, a new catalog barely puts a dent in my mountain of stamps. This whole system and economy works extremely well for new and mid-term players, but once items are exhausted, the incentive structure collapses a bit for us dedicated players. Players can manage all of these cosmetics and can view stats and other things within their personal cell in the sleep room. This includes a badge system, which serves to track numerous stats over multiple trial runs, but I'll be discussing this more in the achievements section, as each badge has its own corresponding achievement. As players complete more trials, they will eventually accumulate enough rebirth tokens, the other universal trial reward, to complete the rebirth procedure. This serves as a further incentive and additional goal for continued grinding, with outfit rewards and related tasks for repeated rebirths that award cosmetic trophies for the sleep room. Rebirth was recently updated to include a large XP reward, which was essentially my only complaint about the system prior to that, so I now believe it is essentially perfect for what it is as well. Prior to this inclusion, Rebirth could feel like an under-rewarding chore with limited benefit to other progression systems, but now there's little reason not to do it. Lastly, I want to talk about the grading system, which functions as an incentive in its own right. At the conclusion of each trial, players are presented with an evaluation screen showing their completion time and their final grade. Grades range from D to A+ for completed trials, with A+ essentially requiring completion of the secondary objective. Performance is evaluated through a mix of positive and negative actions. Things like taking damage or losing sanity detracts from your score, while using items, helping your teammates, and completing objectives will add to it. One of the most interesting and unique design choices here is that completion time has no impact on grading whatsoever. This cleanly separates survival mastery from speedrunning, allowing players to pursue perfection without feeling pressured to rush through the trial. In isolation, that's a pretty smart decision, and it helps the game feel accessible to a wide range of playstyles. Players who want to push themselves can still chase A+ speedruns, but the system doesn't demand it or really reward it. The evaluation screen itself is mostly effective, clearly listing the actions that influence the final grade. However, it suffers from transparency issues in certain spots. Certain events, for example, are weighted far more heavily than others, and the exact values aren't visible without consulting external resources. Additionally, if too many unique events occur during a trial, the evaluation report can sometimes cut itself off, which will leave out relevant information entirely. More importantly, while grading is a compelling motivator early on, its impact can somewhat diminish over time. Once a player understands what is required to consistently earn A+ grades, the system itself is no longer evolving. There's little room for further expression beyond just playing cleanly. The grading system does not meaningfully acknowledge increased efficiency, mastery, or the continued repetition that you get better at. At that point, the incentive shifts away from performance itself and towards simply minimizing the friction in between your trial attempts. And this is where the game's greatest strength, replayability, begins to intersect with its biggest long-term challenge. And that brings us to replayability versus repetition. For the Outlast Trials to succeed, its replayability is foundational. Every major system in the game, from progression to difficulty to incentives, assumes the players will repeat trials dozens or even hundreds of times. And for the most part, that works. Mastery feels rewarding, and repetition is often engaging rather than exhausting. However, repetition also has a way of revealing friction. As players become more experienced, their goals will naturally shift a bit. Survival gives way to efficiency, fear gives way to execution. And while the game does an excellent job rewarding clean and careful play, its systems don't fully adapt to that shift in priorities. This becomes apparent when looking back at the grading system. Grades are a strong incentive early on, encouraging players to learn mechanics and play thoughtfully to get a better grade. But once a player understands how to consistently achieve A+ grades, that incentive plateaus. The system stops evolving even as the player themselves continues to improve. At that point, efficiency becomes self-motivated rather than systematically rewarded, and that's where friction begins to matter. One of the most visible examples of this friction is loading and transition time. Entering a trial involves multiple layers of downtime. You have to select the trial, load into the shuttle, sit through the dialogue and hallucination sequence, and then finally arrive at the trial itself. These elements are atmospheric and effective the first few times they occur, but over many repeated runs they become a significant time tax, especially for players who attempt difficult trials, practice optimizations, or reset frequently. This friction is compounded by the lack of quick restart options. While the game allows players to retry after fully dying, there's no clean way to immediately reset a run without completely failing. Every attempt, successful or not, carries a fixed overhead cost. When multiplied across hundreds of runs, that overhead becomes impossible to ignore. What makes this tension especially notable is that the Outlast Trials encourages mastery and repetition, but offers very few ways to compress or streamline things for players who have already demonstrated that proficiency. Once fear is gone and the systems are understood, the game continues to treat every single run as if it were your first or second attempt. None of this undermines the game's core strength, but it does highlight a ceiling that repetition eventually hits. Once mastery is achieved, the long-term experience starts to hinge less on the trials themselves and more on a player's intrinsic motivation for challenge and how much friction they're willing to tolerate between those attempts. In this section, I want to break down the game's achievement list, how it functions mechanically, and what kind of completionist experience it actually offers. As mentioned previously, the badge system in the game, which players can check progress on from the sleep room, has a one-to-one correspondence with the achievements. These are the only achievements for the game, so I would say the achievement list is pretty lacking compared to their previous titles or to other games in general. The badges are mostly just counters for things that you're often doing in trials, picking up or using items, using your night vision, things like that. Theoretically, you could grind one single trial and eventually complete all of the badges. As a result, the Outlast Trials is primarily a time and repetition based achievement completion rather than a skill based one. There's nothing really encouraging you to push for higher difficulties or get better grades. Given how much the game emphasizes these systems as player incentives elsewhere, it's surprising how little of that is reflected in the achievement list. In the past, the game included badges for completing each of the main trials, but those have been removed in past updates. Adding those back at a minimum would at least require experiencing each of the main trials in the game in order to complete it. Even with that, the lack of an incentive to master the game and play well, to receive higher grades or complete higher difficulties, is a pretty major shortcoming of this achievement list. Something I want to include in all of these critiques going forward is a section mentioning a few very specific things, the rarest and most common achievements in the game, and, importantly, if the game has any broken or multiplayer required achievements. In the Outlast Trials, the most common achievement is Marathoner, which is obtained by sprinting for a cumulative hour within the trials, and the rarest achievement is Sleight of Hand, which requires unlocking 100 containers with lockpicks. The game does have 2 multiplayer required achievements centered around helping your teammates, so be aware of that. Generally, I'm not a fan of achievements that require multiplayer, but they're not really the worst in the case of games which place a heavy emphasis on being multiplayer focused, like the Outlast Trials, and thankfully no achievements in the Outlast Trials are currently broken. Next, I will discuss my completion statistics and opinions on the completion overall. The Outlast Trials was originally in early access for 10 months and did not receive achievements until the 1.0 release. However, the badges existed in early access and were already tracked. As such, I immediately unlocked all 27 achievements when 1.0 released on March 5th, 2024, which is my completion date for the game. At the time, I had 165 hours on the game, though this is not really an accurate representation of completion time due to the caveats with early access I mentioned, so I wouldn't worry about it taking that long to complete if you are grinding for it. Overall, I would give the achievements a difficulty rating of about a 4 out of 10 and an enjoyment rating of 10 out of 10 since it's one of my favorite games of all time. In this rating, difficulty reflects mechanical challenge, time investment, and grind for the achievements all combined. Enjoyment reflects my overall experience with the game and doesn't only reflect the achievement hunt itself. As a completionist experience, the Outlast Trials is quite approachable and very enjoyable, but it leaves a lot of untapped potential from the game on the table. And with that, this wraps up the first video in what I hope becomes a much longer running completionist critique series on this channel. This was definitely a bit of a departure from my usual content, but it's something I've really wanted to do for a long time, as I mentioned at the beginning. As of this recording, I've 100% completed 286 games on Steam, so I have no shortage of experiences to pull from to make more videos. And I think this format really has a lot of room to grow and evolve. So if you made it all the way through, thank you genuinely for watching. And I would really appreciate any feedback in the comments on what worked in the video, what didn't, and what you'd like to see going forward for future videos like this. For anyone who is here primarily for the Outlast Trials, again, a huge thank you for watching this entire video, but nothing will be changing in terms of my content there. I'll still be covering all the updates, the educational content, any events, and doing my live streams like always. This series will just be an addition, a way for me to branch out into other games that I'm also pretty passionate about, while still bringing the same level of depth to the main game I will be covering, which is the Outlast Trials. If you enjoyed this video, do not forget to smash the like button, and if you know someone who'd be interested in this more long-form critique type of content, which again is pretty different from what I usually do, sharing it would really mean a lot to me because I'd like to get input from people who maybe haven't already seen my other stuff. I've also got links in the description to join my Discord. Follow me on Twitch if you're interested in any of that. Thanks again for watching the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace out.